All thoughts, feelings, and actions start with the nervous system. The primary function of the nervous system is to transfer and exchange information. The neuron, nerve cell, is the basic cellular unit of the nervous system responsible for conducting impulses from one part of the body to another. Components of the neuron. There's the cell body, which is the soma, has a nucleus and the cytoplasm. The cell axon, the stem, transmits signals away from the cell body. Then there's dendrites, send signals from other neurons toward the cell body. The nervous system is split up into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the spinal cord and the brain, and the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is split up into sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is the excitatory, preparing for stress. Parasympathetic, rest and digest, decreased activity, decreased organ activity. And the autonomic nervous system is responsible for many things, but to recap, involuntary movement and maintaining hemostasis. The neuroanatomy and the brain. Brain tissue is categorized as gray matter or white matter. The white matter is the myelinated axons of neurons. Gray matter is composed of nerve cell bodies and dendrites. The working area of the brain contains the synapses. The outermost brain surface provides anatomical landmarks or reference points. The function is to increase the brain's surface area. The grooves contain the sulci, fissures, and gyri. The brain is subdivided into the cerebrum and the brainstem. The cerebrum is divided into the right hemisphere and left hemisphere, and the brainstem is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The brainstem connects the cerebrum to the brain, to the spinal cord, and to the cerebellum. And each cerebrum, right and left hemisphere, is divided into 4 lobes. The left hemisphere controls most right side body functions, and the right hemisphere controls most left-sided body functions. Both hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum, which is a sensory information exchange between the 2 hemispheres. The 4 lobes are listed here: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe. The frontal lobe is the largest and most developed lobe. The functions are motor function is responsible for controlling voluntary motor activity of specific muscles. The premotor area coordinates movement and multiple muscles. The association area, the association cortex, allows for multimodal sensory input to trigger memory and lead to decision making. It is the seat of executive functions such as working memory, reasoning, planning, prioritizing, sequencing, insight, flexibility, judgment, impulse, behavioral, cueing, intelligence, and abstraction. The frontal lobe contained in the frontal lobe is also the Broca's area that's responsible for expressive speech. Personality variables, the most focal area for personality development is the frontal lobe. Problems in the frontal lobe can lead to personality changes, emotional and intellectual changes. The temporal lobe contains the Wernicke's area, which is the receptive speech and or language comprehension. It's the primary auditory area, memory and emotion, integration of vision with sensory information. Problems in the temporal lobe can lead to visual or auditory hallucinations, aphasia, and amnesia. The occipital lobe is the primary visual cortex. Integration area innervates vision with other sensory information. Problems in the occipital lobe can lead to visual field defects, blindness, and visual hallucinations. The parietal lobe is the primary sensory area. Taste, reading, and writing. Problems in the parietal lobe can lead to sensory perceptual disturbances and agnosia, difficulty interpreting sensation. The cerebrum includes the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the basal ganglia. The cerebral cortex controls a wide array of behaviors. It controls the contralateral or opposite side of the body. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. Sensory information is relayed from the thalamus and then processed and integrated in the cortex. The cerebrum is responsible for much of the behavior that makes us human: speech, cognition, judgment, perception, and motor function. The limbic system is the essential system for the regulation and modulation of emotions and memory. It's composed of the hypothalamus, thalamus, hippocampus, and the amygdala. The hypothalamus plays key roles in various regulatory functions such as appetite, sensations of hunger, thirst, water balance, circadian rhythm, body temperature, libido, and hormonal regulation. The thalamus is the sensory relay station, except for smell, modulates flow of sensory information to prevent overwhelming the cortex. It regulates emotions, memory, and related affective behaviors. The amygdala is responsible for mediating mood, fear, emotion, and aggression, and it's also responsible for connecting sensory smell information with emotions. The basal ganglia, also known as the corpus striatum, serves as a complex feedback system to modulate and stabilize somatic motor activity. Information conveyed from the central nervous system to skeletal muscles. The basal ganglia plays a role in movement initiation, complex motor functions with association connections. The basal ganglia functions in learning and automatic actions such as walking or driving a car. The basal ganglia contains the extrapyramidal motor system or nerve tract. And the basal ganglia functions in involuntary motor activities such as muscle tone, posture coordination, muscle movement, and complex reflexes. Many psychotropic medications can affect the extrapyramidal motor nerve tract, causing involuntary movement side effects. And the basal ganglia contains both the caudate and the putamen. Problems in the basal ganglia can lead to bradykinesia, hyperkinesias, and dystonia, meaning the muscles contract involuntarily. The brainstem is made up of cells that produce neurotransmitters. It includes the midbrain, pons, medulla, cerebellum, and reticular formation. The cerebellum is responsible for maintaining equilibrium. It acts as a gross movement control center. Each hemisphere of the cerebellum has ipsilateral control, so same side of the body. Problems with the cerebellum can lead to ataxia, which is uncoordinated and inaccurate movements. And the Romberg test is important for detecting deficiencies in cerebellar functioning. The midbrain houses the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra, areas of dopamine synthesis. The pons houses the locus coeruleus, which is the area of norepinephrine synthesis. The medulla is, together with the pons, contains autonomic control centers that regulate internal body functions. The reticular formation system is the primitive brain. It receives input from the cortex, an integration area for input from post-sensory pathways. It innervates the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the cortex. It's responsible for the regulation of involuntary movement, reflex, muscle tone, vital sign control, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and it is critical to consciousness and ability to mentally focus, to be alert, and pay attention to environmental stimuli. Neurophysiology and the brain. There are two classes of cells in the nervous system. There's glia and neurons. Glia are structures that form the myelin sheath around axons and provide protection and support. Neurons are nerve cells responsible for conducting impulses from one part of the body to another. Components of a neuron are the cell body, dendrites, and axon. The cell body, also known as the soma, is made up of the nucleus and the cytoplasm within the cell membrane. Dendrites receive information to conduct impulses toward the cell body, and axon sends or conducts information away from the cell body. Synapse, or the synaptic cleft, is the connection site and area of communication between neurons where neurotransmitters are released. The synapse converts an electrical signal, also known as an action potential, from the presynaptic neuron into a chemical signal, the neuron transmitter, that is transferred to the postsynaptic neuron. Neurotransmitters are released at the synaptic cleft as the result of an electrical activity or an action potential. There are two phases of an action potential. There's depolarization and repolarization. Depolarization is the initial phase of the action potential when sodium and calcium ions flow into the cell. This is an excitatory response. And repolarization is the restoration phase when potassium leaves the cell or chloride enters the cell, and this is an inhibitory response. Problems in either of the structure or chemistry of the synapse interrupt normal flow of impulses and stimuli, which then contribute to symptoms commonly seen in psychiatric disorders. Neurotransmitters are chemicals synthesized from dietary substrates that communicate information from one cell to another. The neurotransmitter will be released from the presynaptic neuron, cross the synapse, and then bind to a specific receptor on the postsynaptic neuron. Specific criteria must be met for a molecule to be classified as a neurotransmitter. Categories of neurotransmitters are monoamines, amino acids, cholinergics, and neuropeptides. The monoamines are also known as biogenic amines, and that's dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and serotonin. Dopamine is known as a catecholamine, and it's produced in the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area, the VTA. The precursor is tyrosine, removed from the synaptic cleft by monoamine oxidase, MAO, enzymatic action. There are 4 dopaminergic pathways: the mesocortical, mesolimbic, nigrostriatal, and tuberoinfundibular. Norepinephrine, also known as a catecholamine, is produced in the locus coeruleus of the pons. The precursor is tyrosine, removed from the synaptic cleft and returned to storage via an active reuptake process. It's a major neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine is a major neurotransmitter implicated in mood, anxiety, and concentration disorders. Epinephrine, also known as a catecholamine, is produced in the adrenal glands. The epinephrine system is also referred to as the adrenergic system. Serotonin is known as an indole, produced in the raphe nuclei of the brainstem. Precursor is tryptophan, removed from the synaptic cleft and returned to storage via an active reuptake process. It's the major neurotransmitter implicated in mood and anxiety disorders. The amino acids are glutamate, aspartate, GABA, and glycine. Glutamate is a universal excitatory neurotransmitter. It's the major neurotransmitter involved in the process of kindling, which is implicated in seizure disorders and possibly bipolar disorder. An imbalance of glutamate is implicated in mood disorders and also in schizophrenia. Aspartate is yet another excitatory neurotransmitter and often works with glutamate. GABA is a universal inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's the site of action for benzodiazepines, alcohol, barbiturates, and other central nervous system depressants. Glycine is another inhibitory neurotransmitter and it works with GABA. The cholinergics are acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is synthesized by the basal nucleus of Maynard. The precursors are acetylcoenzyme A and choline. Neuropeptides, non-opioid type, substance P, and somatostatin or statin. They are endorphins, enkephalins, and dynorphins. They modulate pain. Decreased amount of neuropeptides is thought to cause substance abuse. So decreased amount of neuropeptides, that's the opioid type, endorphins, enkephalins, and dynorphins, are thought to cause substance abuse. Recovery and degradation of neurotransmitters. After the neurotransmitter reaches the postsynaptic neuron, it may then diffuse off its receptor to be destroyed by enzymes or to be transported back to the presynaptic neuron for reuse. Enzymatic destruction occurs either in the cytosol or in the synapse. The neurotransmitter can be destroyed by the enzymes monoamine oxidase, that's MAO, in the cytosol, or by COMT intracellularly or in the synapse. Neurotransmitters implicated in psychiatric disorders. Acetylcholine is decreased in Alzheimer's disease and impaired memory, and it is increased in Parkinsonian symptoms. So acetylcholine is increased in Parkinsonian symptoms. Dopamine is decreased in Parkinson's, substance abuse, and depression. Dopamine is decreased in Parkinson's, substance abuse, and depression. Dopamine is increased. There's an increase of dopamine in the context of psychosis, schizophrenia, and anxiety. There's too much dopamine in psychosis, schizophrenia, and anxiety. Serotonin is thought to be decreased in depression, schizophrenia, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. GABA is decreased in anxiety disorders. Glutamate is decreased in memory impairment, learning difficulty, negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And glutamate is thought to be increased in bipolar, psychosis from excess pruning, and in psychosis from neurotoxicity. That's glutamate increase in psychosis from excess pruning and psychosis from neurotoxicity. Opioid neuropeptides are thought to be decreased in substance abuse. Common receptors in psychiatry. Dopamine receptors D1 and D2. The function is thinking, decision-making, reward-seeking behavior, fine muscle action, integrated cognition. Blocking or a deficit of dopamine receptors will result in, if it's a mild deficit of these receptors or a mild blockade of these receptors, it will cause poor impulse control, lack of abstractive thought. A severe deficit of these receptors will result in Parkinson's, endocrine alterations, and movement disorders such as EPS. A mild excess of these receptors are improved creativity, improved abstractive ability, improved executive function, but a severe excess of these dopamine receptors will result in disorganized thinking, loose associations, tics, and stereotypic movements. Norepinephrine receptors alpha 1 and alpha 2. The function is alertness, focused attention, orientation. It primes the fight or flight, learning, and memory. A deficit of norepinephrine receptors results in dullness, low energy, and depressive affect. An excess of norepinephrine receptors are anxiety, hyper-alertness, increased startle response, paranoia, and decreased appetite. Serotonin receptors are 5-HT1A, 5-HT1D, 5-HT2, 5-HT2A, 5-HT3, and 5-HT4. The function of serotonin receptors are sleep regulation, pain perception, mood states, temperature, aggression regulation, libido, and melatonin precursor. A deficit of serotonin receptors results in irritability, hostility, depression, sleep dysregulation, decreased appetite, and decreased libido, and that's a deficit of these receptors. An excess of these serotonin receptors can lead to sedation, aggression, and hallucinations, which is rare. Acetylcholine receptors are nicotinic and muscarinic. The function of these receptors are attention, memory, mood regulation, REM, sleep, sexual behavior, and muscle tone. A deficit of these acetylcholine receptors are lack of inhibition, decreased memory, euphoria, antisocial action, decreased speech quantity, dry mouth, blurred vision, and constipation. An excess of these receptors are overinhibition, anxiety, depression, somatic complaints, self-consciousness, drooling, and EPS. GABA receptors are GABA A and GABA B. The function is arousal level control, aggression level control, anxiety level control, and excitation level control. Deficit of GABA receptors lead to irritable, hostile, increased tension, increased worry, anxiety, and seizure activity. An excess of these receptors results in reduced cellular excitability, increased sedation, and impaired memory. That's an excess of GABA receptors. Glutamate receptors are AMPA and NMDA. The function are memory, sustained attention, and automatic functions. Deficit of glutamate receptors result in poor memory, low energy, and distractible, and excess of glutamate receptors result in kindling, seizures, anxiety, and panic. Peptide receptors, the opioid type, are mu, kappa, epsilon, delta, and sigma. The function are emotion modulation, stress reaction modulation, reward center function, and memory consolidation. Deficit of peptide receptor opioid type are hypersensitivity to pain, hypersensitivity to stress, decreased pleasure sensation, and dysphoria. An excess of these opioid receptors are insensitivity to pain, catatonic-like movement, auditory hallucinations, and decreased memory. Neuroimaging assessment and diagnostic procedures. Techniques that permit observation of the brain can be divided into 3 categories: structural imaging, functional imaging, and combined structural and functional imaging. Structural imaging provides evidence of the size and shape of anatomical structures. Common structural imaging tests include a CT and an MRI. A CT is a computed tomography. It provides a 3-dimensional view of the brain structures, differentiates structures based on density, provides suggestive evidence of brain-based problems, but it's not specific testing for psychiatric disorders. Advantages of a CT is that it's widely available and relatively inexpensive. Disadvantages are its lack of sensitivity and cannot differentiate white matter from gray matter, cannot view structures close to the bone tissue, and there's underestimation of brain atrophy, and there also is an inability to image sagittal and coronal views. Moving on to magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, which provides a series of 2-dimensional images that represent the brain. Advantages can be that can view the brain structures close to the skull and can separate white matter from gray matter. It's readily available, and the resolution of the brain tissue is superior to CT scanning. The disadvantages of an MRI is that it's expensive. Many contraindications to its use, such as clients with pacemakers or any metallic implants, such as orthopedic screws or plates, or on ventilators. Clients with claustrophobia often are unable to complete the study because of the design of the machinery, which is an enclosed tube-like structure with a confining environment. Functional imaging is a technique that measures function of areas of the brain and bases the resulting assessment on blood flow. It may use radioactive pharmaceuticals to cross the blood-brain barrier, and it's mainly used for research. That's functional imaging. Some common functional imaging tests include EEG and evoked potentials testing. It's the least expensive test that conveys information on electrical functioning of the central nervous system. Then there is the MEG, or magnetoencephalography. It's similar to the EEG but detects different electrical activities, often used in a complementary fashion with EEG testing. Then there's the SPECT, or single photon emission computed tomography, which provides information on cerebral blood flow, but it's limited in availability. It's expensive, but less than the positron emission tomography. Positron emission tomography, it provides images of the brain when positron emitting radionuclei interact with an electron. It's an expensive procedure that requires extensive resources and a support team. The combined structural and functional imaging is the newest imaging, and it attempts to examine structure in conjunction with function, currently mainly used for research. The available tests are functional MRI, which is fMRI, 3-dimensional event-related functional MRI, the fluorine magnetic spectroscopy, and dopamine D2 receptor binding. Genomics, family history, family tree, or pedigree. It's a tool in determining the likelihood of genetic disorder in the family, inheritance patterns, and the risk of recurrence in family members. That's genomics. The Surgeon General recommended that families know their family history. That's the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The pedigree symbols in drawing a family tree indicate male, female, marriage, divorce, adoption, twins, pregnancy, consanguinity, which means relatives having children, and conditions. Family history starts with current family and moves back to grandparents. Autosomal dominant conditions may be present in more than one generation and in up to 50% of offspring when one parent is affected. An example of an autosomal dominant disorder is Marfan syndrome or condition. Recessive conditions appear only in one generation, affected people who have two copies of a faulty gene, one from each unaffected parent. An example of this is hemochromatosis or cystic fibrosis. That's recessive conditions. X-linked disorders are caused by faulty genes on an X chromosome, for example, Fragile X syndrome or color blindness are X-linked disorders. Risk assessment is based on inheritance patterns and may be described as a percentage of risk. Genetic counseling is a communication process used when a client has a genetic risk and often involves offering a test that could provide information about the genetic status of the person and possible implications for the family. A genetic counselor is someone whose primary role is to offer information and support to people concerned about an illness that may have a genetic basis. A referral to a genetic counselor may be needed when a client is anticipating pregnancy and or concerned for the health of the fetus. Genetic terms are chromosomes, DNA, genes, messenger RNA, that's mRNA, the Human Genome Project, a phenotype, gene therapy, and personalized medicine. Genetic terms and definitions. Chromosomes are structures of DNA in the nucleus of cells. There are normally 46 chromosomes in humans, and that's 23 pairs. 46 chromosomes in humans, and that's 23 pairs. DNA is made up of two twisted, paired strands composed of sugars linked by 4 nucleotide bases, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, specifying the amino acids that make proteins. A is always paired with T, and G is always paired with C. Genes are a sequence of DNA that cause human characteristics to be passed to the next generation. Genes direct the production of proteins. Messenger RNA, mRNA are codes for an amino acid. The Human Genome Project mapped the entire nucleotide sequence of the human genome in 2003. The genome is a complete set of DNA. A phenotype is the observable characteristic of a specific trait that is connected to the genetic contributions to that trait. For example, a fast metabolizer of the CYP450 2D6 medications. Gene therapy involves replacing a faulty copy of a gene with a healthy copy of the same gene. Personalized medicine is healthcare based on genetic variability. Studies of population genetics. Family studies investigate the occurrence of disorders in first-degree relatives, parents, siblings, and offspring, and second-degree relatives such as grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles. Twin studies survey the concordance rate or the presence of a disorder in monozygote identical twins and dizygote fraternal twins. Adoption studies investigate the risk of a disorder developing in children raised in a different environment from the biologic parent with a specific disorder. Strong genetic contributions have been found for most psychiatric disorders, with a range of 40 to 90% heritability for some disorders, such as, for example, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or bipolar disorder. Genes are risk factors that make a person vulnerable to developing the illness when combined with certain environmental risk factors that increase susceptibility of developing the disorder. Environmental risk factors include prenatal insults, stress, infections, poor nutrition, exposure to toxins, catastrophic loss, and physical and sexual abuse. Most diseases are multifactorial, caused by both environmental and genetic factors. Single gene disorders are rare. Pharmacogenomics are genes account for differences in the way enzymes metabolize drugs. Medications may act differently based on how genes affect metabolism. Genetic testing or genetic profiling helps identify the presence of gene variants that may help determine dosing of medication. Testing for presence of HLA-B1502 allele, an inherited variant of HLA HLA-B gene is required by the FDA in people of Asian descent prior to prescribing the anticonvulsant carbamazepine, due to the risk of Stevens-Johnson syndrome and toxic epidermal necrolysis.